So my award for worst design of anything ever definitely goes to Ford for this. Whoever designed this, you're an idiot. Not a chance you get that off with that in the way. Stupid. What's going on, guys? So today I just want to take you through the kind of chain reaction of issues that occurred after we replaced the gearbox. As you can see here, one of the studs where the wiring attaches to the back of the starter motor just completely ripped out of the casing. So I'm pretty sure that's why the car wasn't starting after we refitted everything. Now, there was a couple of things that I needed to do to the new starter motor just to get it ready to go in the car. So I needed to move this bracket over because the new one didn't come with one. And I had to take off the old wiring harness because it had kind of just been chopped when it had been removed from whatever car it came off. So yeah, there was that to do. And I just wanted to give all the contacts a little clean as well, just to make sure we got a really good connection when we fitted this starter motor back into the car. So I just used some wire brushes and a bit of electrical contact cleaner just to clean up where the wiring sort of mounts onto the back of the starter, and then we're ready to refit the starter motor, which wasn't actually as hard as I was expecting it to be. Now, when I took the starter motor out, it was a real faff. I had to remove all sorts of stuff like the throttle body and a lot of the wiring that kind of runs up across the front of the engine bay. And as you can see here, well, actually on camera now, it doesn't actually look like there was that little room to actually get this thing back in, but trust me, it was quite a squeeze trying to get the starter motor back in there. I mean, these starter motors are pretty damn big for where they've got to go. I just wanted to have a quick check of the wiring, and yeah, it was pretty nasty, so I went ahead and cleaned some of that up as well, again with like a wire brush and some electrical contact cleaner, just so that we've got a really good connection when the starter motor goes back in. Now, it was really difficult to film this because, like I said, there was not a lot of space in there, and that's also kind of the reason why I'm doing this kind of voiceover style of video. So I hope you guys are okay with this, but I've noticed the footage wasn't the best, and it was just an absolute faff to edit, so I thought I'd make it a little bit easier on myself, and hopefully on you guys watching as well. And I just do this kind of voiceover style, so let me know what you think of that in the comments. So there we go, we're reseating the starter motor there. It was actually, like I say, easier to get in than it was to get out. It just kind of slots in, there's not really anything tricky to it. The hardest bit is the wiring, and I did have an issue getting that bracket I swapped over to line up, but I got it in, I got the bolts in, and I also got the wiring in, and like I said, sorry that was all off camera. As you can see now, I kind of just skipped forward with the footage to everything pretty much being reassembled. It's because I was pretty rushed for time, I was losing daylight, and you know, I was just struggling to get everything done in time. But to actually get the starter motor out in the first place, I had to remove so much stuff, like so many parts, like the intake had to come off, the throttle body had to come off, a load of wiring that runs across the front of the engine, you know, up over the inlet manifold, all that had to come off. So it was just really the process of putting all that back on, so you didn't really miss too much, I guess. So then it was time to reconnect the battery and then start it up.
So we're going to try and start it. I think I've done everything. We'll find out in a minute. What do we reckon? What do we reckon, guys?
We've got power. What do we reckon? Hey! She starts! No way! Oh. We did it! It starts. Oh my god. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why are you getting so excited over swapping a starter motor? And yeah, you're probably right. Maybe I was a little bit overexcited for this, but you know, after swapping the gearbox and then having more issues and then finding out that the starter motor was stuffed and having to replace that, you know, I was pretty excited to finally get this thing started. I was excited to drive it.
We did it, me and Ash did it,
but the excitement didn't really last too long.
I've got to tell him, I'll be right back.
A couple of days after I replaced the starter motor, I was driving the car and it just cut out and it wouldn't restart. So this prompted me to check the voltage on the battery, which, as you can just see there, was below 12 volts. I then started the engine and had another check on the battery voltage, because you'd expect to see the battery voltage increase when you start the engine as the alternator starts to charge the battery. But as you can see here, we still had below 12 volts and even less than we had before we started the car. So this pointed to the alternator not charging the battery. So that was my next step. I went ahead and ordered a replacement alternator, and then went about fitting the damn thing, and as you can see from the clip now, it's buried right down behind the back of the engine bay, and it is an absolute nightmare to get to. Now, it didn't feel like 5 minutes since I reconnected this battery, but once again, it was time to remove it. So before I could start unbolting the alternator, the first thing I needed to do was relieve the tension on the auxiliary belt. Firstly, using the longest spanner I could find, which unfortunately wasn't that long, I relieved the tension on the belt, and then I was able to slip the belt over the top of the alternator pulley, which you can just see above the tensioner pulley here. Now with the belt disconnected, this is where I ran into my first problem, and it had to do with the spanner I was using. As you can see there, the spanner is now stuck on the tensioner pulley, and it's wedged up on part of the frame of the car. I kind of just left it like that for the time being, and I managed to sort that later on, and I did end up ordering some longer spanners to get this job finished, but I left it like that for the time being while I tried to remove the alternator. Now the guide I was using to do this told me that I need to remove part of the exhaust, or at least disconnect part of it so I could maneuver it out of the way. I can't really see, after I finished this job, why I needed to do this, and I was kind of annoyed because I ended up shearing one of the studs that connects the downpipe to the manifold. So that was a pain, but we addressed that later. I just ended up sticking a bolt through it. Now, as you've probably noticed, there isn't an awful lot of room under here. So I unbolted one side of the transaxle mount, and this allowed me to swing the engine forward to give us a bit more clearance when we finally dropped the alternator. But before we could do that, I needed to disconnect the wiring. Now, the first problem was access, but that was the least of my worries. There was something else that I'll show you in a minute that was just impossible to get off with the alternator in the car. This was the wiring harness, and it's kind of covered by this plastic air ducting thing that I'm guessing cools the alternator down, but there's like a locking pin in there, or like a tab, or whatever you want to call it, that you have to release to be able to pull that connector out of there, but you just can't get your finger or a tool or anything in there to release it. And this really wound me up. Like, I was getting so angry, I absolutely lost my head trying to do this, to the point where I just gave up on the wiring completely and moved on to trying to remove the bolts that held the alternator to the engine. And that air duct that was in the way of the wiring harness was also in the way of those bolts. But I eventually got those bolts out and got the alternator loose. But then it was kind of just hanging there because of that wiring still being attached. So that was the next job to try and tackle. With the alternator loose, I had another crack at trying to release that wiring harness just with my fingers. But as you can see here, because of that plastic shroud that's on it, that like air duct thing, there's just no room to get your hands in there at all. So we resorted to plan B. And I ended up just cutting the wiring off with a view to soldering it back on later. And with the wiring finally free, it was time to try and drop the alternator. One thing I didn't show you, because I couldn't actually find the footage, there's like a little bracket that holds a bearing that goes around the drive shaft on the driver's side. So I just had to unbolt that. Again, the bolts were a pig to get to just because of access down here. But once I'd removed that, so you can sort of see that bearing there, just in shot there. That's the bearing around the drive shaft, and yeah, like I say, there's just a bracket that holds that in place. I think it stops the drive shaft popping out of the gearbox and stuff like that. So I removed that, and that gave us a little bit more access, and yeah, now it was just me trying to figure out how on earth I was going to drop this alternator out of here. I had to swing the engine forward quite a bit, and I was getting rained on, as you can see as well, so that was fun. But I finally got it out, and then after letting the alternator know exactly what I thought of it and its stupid design, then it was time to sort out that wiring and finally get the new alternator back in the car. Now, it turned out that even with this plastic shroud removed, it was still an absolute pig to try and get the connector off the alternator. I was trying for quite a while, just trying to squeeze that connector, like the tab that releases it, and pull it off. It wasn't budging. Even with the alternator on the bench in my shed, I still struggled to get the damn connector off, even with a flat blade screwdriver, which I was poking at it for a while. I think eventually I got it off with a pick, but as you're about to see, I wasn't happy. So my award for worst design of anything ever definitely goes to Ford for this nonsense. Jeez. Whoever designed this, you're an idiot. You are a f***ing idiot. Head. There's not a chance you get that off with that in the way. Not a chance. I had to go in it and like jab it with a stupid pick. So I apologise for that little outburst, but as you can see, I was rather upset at the design of this thing. There was more, but you don't need to see all that right now. Okay, go on, maybe a little bit more. Stupid. Stupid! So after expressing my disgust at the problem that the Ford engineers had created for me, I then set about rectifying it. I started by stripping back the wiring on the plug, which I was apparently really keen on showing people my good workmanship, as opposed to that of Ford's. And then I set about stripping back the wiring on the loom in the car. I put some heat shrink over the ends of the wires just to make sure they were nice and watertight once I'd soldered them back together. And then I set about twisting the ends of the wires together, ready to solder them. I cracked out the soldering iron, and before long it was like the plug was never even chopped. Well, maybe not quite, but we got there in the end, and this is quite a few months later that I'm finally getting this video out to you, and it still seems to be working, so I think I did a pretty good job. Much better than Ford didn't design this thing anyway. Right, I promise that's the last thing I'm going to say about it now, I promise, but honestly, that shroud thing and that connector really pissed me off. So with that wiring sorted and that plug finally reattached, it was time to get back under the car and fit the new alternator, if I could get it up there. As you can see, I had to move the engine about quite a bit to try and wiggle the alternator back into place, and it was really difficult to get the damn thing in there, and I've got a feeling that in a minute the camera dies and I don't really manage to get much filmed. To be honest, I don't think I'll be able to film much of it anyway, because it was really tight for space for me and the alternator and any tools in there, so getting a camera in the mix as well was just going to be really difficult. I can assure you it was just as much of a pig to fit back in as it was to get out. Now, once I had the alternator bolted back in place, it was time to put the auxiliary belt back on. So I picked up some extended spanners to help me with that job. So here you can see one of these long ass spanners on the tensioner pulley. So that made it a hell of a lot easier to release the tension on that, just so I could slip the belt back over, every pulley it needed to go over. And then we were pretty much ready to reconnect all the electrics, plug the electrical connectors back in, reconnect the battery, and then start the car and see if the alternator actually charges the battery. And I almost forgot, I still had to refit this bracket that holds the bearing that goes around the driver's side drive shaft. So yeah, this is the bracket that holds it on here, and just like everything else involved with this job, it was an absolute nightmare trying to do up any of the bolts. I was trying a combination of like normal sockets, deep sockets, all sorts of stuff, and nothing would get to it. Eventually I got it on, and then it was just time to button up the last few things, like a bracket that went over the top mounting bolt of the alternator. And once I got that on, I think it was time to reconnect the battery and then start the car. While the battery was off, I gave it a quick charge, and as you can see there, it's up to 12.15 volts before we started the engine. And you'll remember beforehand, the voltage was below 12 volts. So let's see what happens when we start the engine, because if you'll remember rightly before, the voltage actually dropped when we started the car. Now, I'll apologise in advance, the camera does shake around quite a bit when I start the engine here. I didn't mount it in the best place. Also, you'll notice that the battery voltage initially, when we first start, it does drop slightly, just as the electrical system gets going, but then it does settle out, and it does indeed rise up to 14 volts. There you go, you'll see it kind of settles out there around 14.48, 14.49 that we just saw. So that's much better. I mean, that means that the alternator is definitely charging the battery now. You wouldn't see that kind of voltage without the alternator charging it, I don't think. So, I'm pretty happy with that. It means that we've managed to swap the alternator out, and it's worked. So that was definitely faulty before. Happy days. So you'll probably have noticed from the video, I did quieten it down a bit with the audio, but the exhaust was making one hell of a noise when I started it up just there, just because of that stud that sheared off when I had to remove that piece of the exhaust, which I don't actually think I had to do. It said in like a guide I was reading that I had to do it. I definitely don't think I had to do that. I ended up knocking that little stud, what was left of it, back out and just sending a bolt through there and tightening it up that way. I did have to get a new gasket because the one that was on there was absolutely minced, so that was about that. And then the end of the video here is pretty much just me being absolutely gassed about changing an alternator, which in the grand scheme of things isn't that much of a achievement really, but after everything that's happened with the gearbox and the starter motor and the alternator, and I've not done these jobs before, so I was pretty happy with what I've managed to get done myself. So you've got to give me some credit for that. Come on guys, that's got to be worth a subscribe. Anyway, that's going to pretty much end it for this video. I hope you like this style of me sort of talking over it, like after the fact. It's been not as easy to sort of do as I thought it would be, but let me know in the comments what you think. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.